So official. Gotta love that. And just to get us started here, wanted to welcome everybody, introduce myself. I'm Annalise Hager-Preciado. I'm a volunteer with Techqueria. Really excited to be jumping in here today. Also to tell you a little bit more about Techqueria, for those of you who aren't familiar, we are the nonprofit that serves the largest global community of Latinx professionals in tech. So we provide resources and support that Latinx professionals need to thrive and become leaders in the tech industry. We also work with companies to build more Latinx-centered spaces that revolve around career growth and networking to affect change in the tech industry. Personally, since finding Techqueria, I've been attending a bunch of events over the years, which have been amazing. In person, believe it or not, before COVID, virtually since COVID, the summit. I have posted a ton of jobs in the jobs channel. It's one of my favorite things to do, as well as personally referred several people to Lyft as a way to help advance our community. And then also just connected with people over random topics in the variety of Slack channels we have. I especially love the Comida channel, but that's just a personal preference. So hoping that you all get a chance to take advantage of our Slack platform and our community and our events. And you're here today, so you already are, which is super exciting. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to our co-host, to our moderator today. Also happens to be a dear friend of mine, so it was a surprise when I found out he was facilitating today. And that's Michael Tristan, who is the Director of Enablement at KeepTruckin. So Michael, I'll pass it on to you.
Thanks, Annalise. Very excited to be hosting and moderating this talk today on artificial intelligence. So as Annalise mentioned, I'm the Director of Enablement here at KeepTruckin. And very excited to, it's a component of the product that we sell and who we're becoming as a company. AI is more important by the day. But there are also a lot of issues that may come up as we look at AI and the potential impact that it can have on our community. So really excited to dive into a great discussion today. We're very lucky to have four fantastic folks that are joining us. We're going to go into intros in just a moment, but we've got Louver Walker-Hannon, Application Engineer Team Leader at MathWorks. We have Ali Rehan, at KeepTruckin. He's one of our engineering managers focusing on AI and vision products. We have Israel Alguindegue. Sorry, Israel, that's the first time that I look at your full last name. Israel Alguindegue is VP of Analytics at Fortive. And then we have Carlos Kidman, Director of Engineering. So we're very excited to be hosting this talk. We're going to jump right into the discussion here. But before we do, as I mentioned, AI, we hear AI everywhere, and we know that it's a part of so much of our experience. We'll get into a definition in just a moment. The issue at hand really is, according to the ACLU, there's ample evidence that there can be discriminatory harm in AI tools. This harm can, or this discriminatory harm can extend itself even more so to already marginalized groups. And likewise, bias in the data that's used to train the AI can often cause data that is often discriminatory or unrepresentative for people of color, women, or other marginalized groups can rear its head throughout the AI design, development, and implementation. So the question today is really, how do we make artificial intelligence equitable? And that's what we're going to talk about. But first, we'll do a quick round of intros. So to the panelists, we'll start with Ali and then move on to Carlos, Israel, and Lou. We want you to tell us a little bit about how you got into tech, because each of you has a pretty unique pathway. And then more about your current role and what motivates you about the work that you do. So Ali, I'll hand it over to you first.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Michael. And it's a pleasure to be here. So for me, I think growing up, I was always inclined towards technology. So I think what's more relevant is my sort of entrance into the AI space. So I'll talk a bit about it. So during my freshman year, when I was still in college, I saw a project demo where one of our seniors had built this really amazing Harry Potter style magic wand that could control a toy car. it was a very simple application. Like there was a camera looking at the person and their stick and tracking the motion of the stick and moving the car accordingly. But it was fascinating to me, and I was completely hooked. And the reason I was hooked was because to me this was the closest thing to a human vision system. So as humans, we have our eyes, we have brains, we use our eyes as sensors, get the information to our brains. Our brain is able to perceive things and make logical conclusions about the world, and we act accordingly. But what I realized was that computers were not so lucky back then, and they're not so lucky even today. But also the fact that this vision system will be the foundation of robotics and so many other applications down the road. So that was basically my first step into AI. I reached out to a computer vision professor and then joined his lab the following year. Fast forward like 15 years, today I lead the computer vision and AI team at KeepTruckin. We are a part of the safety product group here, and our goal is to basically prevent accidents using AI in our dash cams. In the last few years, we've built a bunch of AI models that help us detect risky driving behavior in real time in the truck and alert the driver. So we do things like close following detection or cell phone usage detection, and these are all the main leading causes of accidents. So we are able to alert the drivers when they engage in this behavior. The reason I'm super excited about everything that we do here is a couple of things. One, from a tech perspective, we are building super innovative AI models that work at a pretty high accuracy rate. Unlike a lot of other AI companies, for example, like AV companies, we are deploying our products today. And it's a fast growing product that has a lot of impact. And most importantly, like we are solving a very meaningful problem here. We are actually saving lives on the road today. So this is all very, very exciting for me.
Awesome. Yeah, and it's inspiring to see it in motion and then to be able to be a part of crafting a pitch and getting all of these great details about the AI and into a pitch that because that's my responsibility, right? Is we build a great product and then we have to go and sell it, and we have to train the team to sell it. So it's really an honor to follow up on those efforts by being able to create a pitch around this. Let's go to Carlos next.
Hello, Carlos Kidman here. So for me, I don't have any degree. I have no formal education in software at all. I have certifications now, but I started as a phone salesman at Sprint Mobile, and someone took a chance on me and thought that I would be really good at software testing because I was pretty good at a card game. So he thought I'd be a great software tester because of that, and that's how I got in. And then from there, I just I loved what they were doing in software testing and software quality, and just a lot of the questions, the exploration, the analysis, like you look at a piece of code and you go, is that a high quality piece of code? And it's such an interesting way to look at it, right? But I just was so intrigued by that I've continued to stay in software testing. I eventually picked up programming, and that got me into test automation and then automation engineering. I started meeting with data scientists as I started trying to solve their problems as well. And that's when I got my first taste of machine learning. And I was like, holy moly, this is really cool stuff. Eventually I landed at Adobe as an engineering manager over automation and productivity engineering. And then I recently left them a few months ago to join a startup that does AI, specifically to help software testing and quality problems. Which, as you can see, is something I'm still very passionate about. And so the fact that I can mix my favorite things together is the reason why I decided to jump and leave Adobe. Nothing wrong with Adobe, y'all. Adobe's amazing, but it just fit me really nicely. So now I'm a director of engineering there, leading all of the engineering and data science and machine learning, all that stuff for now. Don't do as much software testing, but we are looking at how can we create models to test other models for things like bias, privacy, security, those kinds of things too. So that's why this topic in and of itself is near and dear to me as well.
Definitely. We have to figure this out at some point. And I think testing the infrastructure, to your point, is a great way to get there. It'll be really interesting to see how that evolves and continues to, how we continually or continue to solve this problem together. Israel?
Hey, good afternoon, everybody. A pleasure to be here. First of all, I must tell you that I'm from Venezuela, and I have been, I moved here to the US when I was young to go to college, and eventually became part of the community of Latinos that are working in tech. My beginnings are humble. I studied AI many years ago, and at the time I was inspired by, what were at the time called logic program languages, which were intended to represent or to solve problems that you couldn't describe well with algorithms. And there were two things that fascinated me. There was an application called the Truck Bucker Upper, which essentially was this algorithm that will essentially back a truck into a parking spot, which I thought was totally fascinating at the time. And we were obsessed with chess. We wanted to know how to automate chess playing, and you've seen a lot of that, the outcomes of that work much more recently. I worked for a company called Fortive, and the way that I think about AI is different than most of you. I look at AI as an instrument for doing prognostics of primarily very high value equipment. So imagine a jet engine, for example, or a locomotive. What I do is to look at immense amounts of data about their status and performance and trying to predict if they're going to fail, because I like to make sure that I get ahead of the failure and I can prevent catastrophic damage to equipment and downtime in general. So my work is primarily in the industrial space, and looking at how do we keep big assets running and making them run for much longer than they were designed, if you will.
Amazing, thank you. Last but not least, let's go to Louver.
Hello, everyone. I'm very happy to be here. So my full name, as you can see, is Louver Walker Hannon. Feel free to call me Lou. And in terms of, how I got into tech, like a lot of the other panelists when I was younger. So one of the biggest themes for me was being able to explore data in a lot of different forms, whether it was weather data or related to different prices for toys when I was younger. Now, in terms of my current role, so I'm an application engineering team lead with MathWorks. MathWorks makes products such as MATLAB and quite a few others. So in my role, I actually implement AI systems for customers of MathWorks, and they use MathWorks tools for a variety of different applications, whether it's in biotech, automotive, aerospace, etc. I also lead a team of engineers as well who also implement AI tasks for the customers of MathWorks products. In terms of what motivates me the most about the work that I do, I think that I am helping the customers of MathWorks products who are implementing AI by pointing out to them that yes, you're using these tools to build these very powerful systems, whatever they happen to be, but I want you to be aware of documentation with respect to what you're doing with AI. So if you have a certain data set, where did you get this from? Why are you using this? And in terms of tonight, I know that we're going to cover a lot of topics, but the documentation of what people are doing in terms of not just their coding, but their decision-making related to AI is extremely important to me. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, definitely very excited to dive into the topic. Before we do, also want to level set on the definition of what AI means, especially as we get into that discussion. So we'll go to Ali for a quick definition, and then Israel to learn a little bit more about the history and how it applies to us. So Ali?
Absolutely. Yeah, so I think to me, as a broad definition, AI is basically a machine or computer's ability to understand the environment, solve problems, and make decisions just like humans, or maybe better than humans, ideally. So again, like for example, as a human, I know that there's a computer right in front of me, and if I go really fast, like I'll hit my head on the screen and hurt myself and so on, but computers can't make that kind of a decision. Generally, when we're referring to AI today, we are typically talking about machine learning systems. And basically the idea is that we make machines or computers intelligent by using lots and lots of data. You show a program a bunch of different examples of right and wrong, And then hopefully like the machine or the algorithm learns the patterns to solve that problem. For example, if you want to build a model or an AI to detect faces, you would use 10,000 images of faces and 10,000 images of random objects, and the model will automatically like learn that faces have a certain pattern to them. They have eyes, nose, and a face. So that's AI to me.
Yeah, and I think the data aspect is really important. That's where we get into some of the bias issues.
Exactly.
I mean, there's plenty to explore all over the map, but the data really has a big part to play. Israel, how do you see AI impacting our daily lives, and what kind of history can you share?
Sure. Well, I think AI is here, like you said at the beginning, right? So it is already impacting our daily lives. But the interesting thing about AI is that this is not a new set of technologies. This actually goes back to 1956, right? Yeah. And it's grown in popularity and gone into what we call the AI winters, which is times when people didn't believe that the results were compelling or that we had the right algorithms to process data. But it is not even a single technology. It's actually a collection of many technologies, right? So we talk about natural language processing, for example. How do we process language? How do we translate across languages, for example? That's all part of what the AI scope. In vision, how do we recognize patterns? How do we recognize faces, right? How do we recognize objects? And so it goes into all kinds of other realms like predictions and automation. And obviously, it's all driven by this ability of our algorithms to not only mimic human behavior or imitate human behavior, but also make decisions that are consistent with how a human will process data. So it's not a new thing. It's been around forever, not forever, but for at least 50 years. The thing that's happened recently is that, of course, while this was a discipline that was treated as a research topic when I was in school, it's now part of everyday life, and it's getting great traction in the consumer world. So, your Google little thing at home that answers questions is a very powerful AI machine that I could only dream about in my early days, but it's here, and it's a very complex set of algorithms connected that provide pretty impressive results.
I think you're right. It's everywhere, and that's why we're so interested in mitigating bias as it continues to grow so exponentially. It's really important that we have these conversations now. In speaking about bias, let's go to Carlos and get an overview of what you see as the issues in AI today.
I think now it's so mainstream, and not just in using it, right? Things like Alexa and Google and whatnot, but even people getting into it now. The tools are getting more robust. They're becoming easier as well. Someone who has no degree, I'm able to build models and things, right? And so there's power in that, where it's becoming a lot more available for people. But the downside of that is that you have an influx of people coming in that may not be trained in how to work with the data or solve problems in that way. And so things like AI ethics come into play, because yes, you need data, but how you get it could be very responsible or not, right? Having my Google machine listen to me all the time to get more data for educational purposes, right? To train this stuff. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? And that's those kinds of topics like privacy, like security, using of my data to train the model. There has to be some sort of standard there that doesn't just give companies the free will to do whatever they want with our stuff. The other bit would be around things like bias, and I'll give a couple examples. The first one is, let's say that you want, the problem is you want to be able to predict the price of houses, right? And so you gather a bunch of data, and you yourself have your ideas of what you feel you could use to predict on a house, the size of it, I'm sure the amount of bathrooms it has, things like that, right? But the models will learn patterns. It finds patterns in the data that you give it, even ones that you might not realize. So for example, you give it a bunch of house data and it discovers that, wow, every single house with the green door is over $500,000. So then when you ask it, hey, here's a house that has a green door, it could be a shed. And this is a terrible example, but it could be a shed with a green door. And it would go, wait a second, green doors are pretty valuable.
Yeah.
And it would, make the price go up. Terrible example, but that's the patterns that these things learn. And so now let's take a more serious example where when I was at Adobe, whenever I posted a new job application, let's say I was hiring a software tester, I would have 100 applicants within 24 hours. So you can imagine in a week, I would have over 200. Now, one person, how am I supposed to go through 200 applications? It's very difficult. So maybe my problem here is I want a machine learning model that can help me filter these out and give me the candidates that would have the best chance of getting the job. So then I go out to LinkedIn and I go to Monster and Indeed and I go all these places and I grab all these example applications to help me and I train the model with that. Now, the problem here is that there's already going to be a bias. There's an unbalanced data. Why? Because in the tech space, there's going to be more men. And so I'm teaching my model that because there are more men, well, I'm going to be looking for men.
Yeah.
Immediately I introduce a bias. And that's not even talking about the different ethnicities, Latinos, Black people. I'm not even talking about that yet. And so already it's learning patterns that I may not have wanted to introduce, but because I gave it this data, it's going to be giving me a bunch of men. And I'm like, oh, I don't know why my company's not diverse. I don't know why we're not inclusive.
Right.
When I created that problem myself.
And I think the broader question is so interesting here, or the broader implication, I guess I should say, because we're talking about mortgage loan applications, we're talking about all of those kinds of things that could be a barrier for a lot of people. And if we're not mitigating this bias early enough and regularly enough and with enough discipline, it really does present a problem to our community. And those of us that are in this space could be creating more of a problem for the very people that we, love and interact with on a regular basis. So that's the reason for this conversation today. Anybody else? Lou, can we go to you for some thoughts from you on this area?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the topics that stands out for me is, I mentioned documentation, but it's going towards the topic of governance, where you have a variety of different industries that are either it's happened starting a few years ago, and it's definitely happening increasingly more so now, trying to come up with some sort of guidelines in terms of not just the creation of these various AI systems, but also once they are in, I'm going to say, implementation mode, so they're being used out in the public, what are seen as reasonable metrics? It's not maybe just about the accuracy, but also are we going towards some sort of guidelines related to certain industries? Another thing too that tends to happen in my particular case, and this happened to me way back in grad school, is being able to actually identify, what decisions were made? Like, why did you use traditional machine learning versus deep learning as a part of building this overall system? So governance seems to be a large emerging theme, and it's connected to many of the topics that were just mentioned, such as AI ethics. So I think governance is, a theme we're going to keep hearing more and more about related to AI.
Definitely. I mean, from Carlos, we're hearing a lot about responsibility, the responsibility that people need to take upon themselves. And have you been trained to be responsible with this data and the data sets as you're training the AI? So very, very compelling point. Israel, anything to add here?
Well, so I think I recognize the flaws of the technologies we have it today. I think, a lot of it is on us, people that are working on technology, to make sure that we follow the right protocols and that we balance our data sets, and that we're looking at the outcomes with a very curious perspective to say, hey, is there something here that doesn't make sense, right? And that's how we all can contribute to better systems. I do want to say, though, that there is tons of things that are still in development. And I would say, for example, that even our social norms and our governance have not caught up with the technology. That's something that our social engineers and politicians have to work on. But I do think that there is also another way to look at this, which is AI is making enormous contributions in areas where you might want to be optimizing a process. You might be eliminating a task that's dangerous for a human to do. You might be eliminating things that are repetitive and tedious from our daily work, right? So there's a ton of great advantage that AI is creating. that I think overall is going to free us to do things that are much more interesting and more creative, while the AI takes on the tasks that are very tedious and repetitive and even dangerous. So for example, in my world, imagine if you have to go inspect a wind turbine. You know, this is a very, very tall structure. You probably don't want to get to the top of it to figure out what's wrong with the machine, right? And if you can send a drone to do an inspection, that's probably a lot safer than to set a human on a ladder to do that, right? So I think that there's a lot of things that we can do with AI that are going to benefit us greatly. But I do think that there is a gap between, you know, what the technology is able to do and where society is.
Yeah, I mean, what comes to mind is our use case here at KeepTruckin within the safety dash cam space. I mean, Ali mentioned it earlier, but there are lives legitimately being saved because we're warning drivers ahead of time. And it reminds me of what Carlos, you were saying earlier, because I see the struggle here. You know, there's so many great benefits. It's become more approachable, more kind of average people can get in there and start learning how to work with AI. And it's a good thing. But then there's also this bias and this group of people that we're trying to make sure as we get into that space, hey, let's also be mindful. So this tension is real, right? Like that is what makes this such a compelling area to discuss. What do we recommend in terms of how I can get involved, how we can get involved in helping this issue? Let's go to Lou first.
I mean, one of the biggest themes for me is I'm a big believer in representation matters. And I think too often with a variety of scenarios, you don't have people in the room from a variety of communities. And I think one of the biggest themes for me is start that interest in, I'm going to say STEM, but also moving towards AI early on. So I'm a big believer in, you know, try to make certain there are STEM youth outreach programs where the younger generation, the next generation, can get more exposure and at least learn at a very high level about AI. I recently helped out with a workshop for an organization with STEM youth outreach, and they highlighted in their AI workshop, they had 2 slides related to AI bias, and the students who were maybe 7 to 10 years old, they could describe the concept of AI bias extremely well. So once you start at that level and you can build on top of that foundation, I think that's going to help leading to, yes, you have more people from a variety of backgrounds that can be a part of the AI community, not just being users, but being in the background, so to speak, to help create these algorithms and modify them to do so much more.
Yeah, and there's a big future there. There's so much that that it's going to continue to evolve. We're just getting started. And so I think no better time than the present to really get involved and encourage it with the next generation. Ali, any thoughts here?
Yeah, I think I want to talk about it on a more broader level. I think this discussion on bias and generally ethics in AI is probably one of the most important discussions of our time. Like, I think, and the reason why I think it's very important is you can't just assume that somebody else is going to take care of the problem. For example, like as a startup or as a company, you can't rely on a chief ethics officer to come in and enforce this. Each and every one of us who's in the field has to play a part in building the future that's more equitable and unbiased. Yeah. And I think this is specifically important for technologists and engineers in the field. And I think we have to rethink our roles in this discussion. It's not enough to be a good problem solver, but we have to also ask some very deep, hard questions. What problems are we solving? And are the problems that we're solving worth solving in the first place? Then there are multiple ways of solving a problem. So the solution that we pick is that aligned with our personal and organizational values. And maybe like also think about the second and third order effects of the solutions we pick. For example, like Michael, you talked about, and I mentioned earlier how our AI is saving lives on the road today, but at the same time, if our AI does not work well, and let's say it penalizes brown skin more than white skin, then I'm going to get hurt because the AI will generate false positives on me. I will get a worse off score, and my fleet manager will fire me. and I'll lose my job. So whatever we are doing, and like, so we have to think about our solutions and the implications that we'll have. And some of you might have seen the recent news. Facebook has decided to delete facial recognition data on more than 1 billion users. This was one of the core part of the Facebook photos feature, but they took this decision, and I think this is a lesson to be learned from all of this.
Definitely. And yeah, I think you make a good point, and it reminds me of Coded Bias. I was watching that documentary on Netflix, and that's where the main protagonist or the main, the person that the documentary is centered around, that's how she came to see the bias in AI, is through facial recognition, because she's dark skinned and it wouldn't pick up. When she was trying to get recognized, it wouldn't pick her up, or it wouldn't pick her up with the same level of accuracy, or various things like that. It absolutely can have ramifications on real life. And if we don't watch carefully, it might creep up on us in ways that we don't anticipate or don't expect, especially because of the prevalence that we see today. Carlos, what do you think?
So I'm like we've said, it's here, right? AI is here, and it's in a lot of places already, in all of our houses and our phones and everything. So I think we need to help with educating our communities in doing that, and even ones that are not AI specific. Here in Utah, I run the software testing and quality community. And there we're teaching testers how to test machine learning models and data sets and be mindful of things like this. Because it's becoming something that in every company they go, hey, Carlos, I'm getting into machine learning. I have to test it now. I have no idea. I've never tested this before. What the freak is a search engine? What's a recommender? And they ask these questions, and I'm trying to provide ways to educate people in this. So just in my community, Q8 The Point, we're already starting with that. But we also partner with other communities too. So things like Techqueria, or Latinas in Tech, or Coding Color, even the Board of Education. That's why I love what Lou said about even getting the kids involved. My daughter, who is 7 years old, is talking about programming now, and she's like, I want to code. I see you code, and I want to do it too. And it's just becoming, that's why I said mainstream. It's becoming the thing now. Yeah. And Tim Cook, CEO of Apple, he came to Utah for a conference, and he said, I believe that every single kid leaving 6th grade should already know a little bit of code. Crazy, right?
I'm not terribly surprised, to be honest with you. It's true. I mean, we're going in that direction, so it makes sense.
So I think it's up to us as community members to engage with our communities. If you are interested in this space, then engage, ask questions. The worst thing you can do is just sit in silence and go, I hope someone teaches me something. Engage with your communities. For the leaders, help provide the resources, so that way when people do engage, there's something for them to learn. There's direction as well, because AI is a massive space. You can't just say learn AI, right? That doesn't help anyone. So provide the resources and tools in order to say, here's where you start, and go through this course and this course and this course. And at the end of that, you'll have a really good understanding of at least the core concepts of machine learning, and you can be someone talking in the space as well. And there's a lot of free resources, y'all. The internet is a big thing. So lots of free resources, paid ones as well, and many people that are wanting to help out, like everyone on this panel, I'm sure is.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think one of the things you called out in there is leadership and the importance of leadership. I think more than ever in this space, leads need to, regardless of whether or not they're part of underrepresented communities, need to make it a point to model this behavior, model that it's good to bring this up and talk about AI ethics in the conversations and in part of the design. And I think Stephen in the chat is saying, it's fairly easy to make a case that it's bad for business. We need to be pushing back. And I think it's a great point. And especially if we're in positions of leadership. So points well taken all around. Last kind of question before we open up for a Q&A is, there's a common refrain that advancements in artificial intelligence will result in a large scale job loss. I think Israel even alluded to how it's taking place of all of the mundane and administrative tasks and things like that will be a thing of the past. So what does this panel have to say about career opportunities generated as a result of this advancement in AI? And let's go to Israel first, and then we'll kind of open it up to everyone else.
Yeah, so I have two thoughts about this. you know, and I don't mean to be a contrarian, but I think there's another viewpoint here, which is, I think AI is going to create, you know, if you think about it as an expansionist, if you will, it will create new opportunities that we don't yet know, right? It's kind of similar to what happened during the Industrial Revolution.
Right.
Machines were going to, you know, were feared to take over the world, and it turns out that no, that they just kind of provided new products and new new careers for people. So I think that there is also, you know, a great opportunity here to kind of enhance our own experience at work, for example, and even make us more creative and kind of focus on the more difficult problems while we let the machines do the easy stuff.
Yeah.
But I do think that there is an implication here that which is far beyond what we're talking about, which is like, what is the new contract that cities and society have with people, right? So we probably have to rethink our educational programs, right? Are we teaching the right things in school, right? Do we need to be thinking about what the new occupations are going to require? And so there's big implications on this that we haven't yet addressed, and that's why I think that the technology is ahead of society. But I do think that some of these jobs that are very repetitive, that can be automated, will be automated. And so it's incumbent to all of us to kind of rethink, you know, what's my value proposition to society and to my company, and to make sure that we kind of move up in the learning curve so that we can do bigger and better things with that extra time that we're going to have.
I agree. I think it's progress. You know, it's called progress for a reason. You level up, move forward, and we push the thing forward. There's always going to be opportunity in there if we push, you know. Any other points on the panel? Again, the topic is opportunity created by AI.
I know one item from my undergraduate school days in biomedical engineering is related to healthcare, where there was so much analysis that needed to be done. It's to Israel's point, where, you know, before AI was so prominent, there were a lot of techniques that were used to implement analysis, but a lot of times this analysis couldn't be done very quickly. Now you have a variety of systems that can detect a variety of different types of cells that could be harmful in the human body. You have a variety of tools and techniques that can help out with transcribing languages. Granted, some of those systems don't do it very well in some cases, but you know, they're going to learn, where there's a lot of usefulness out of AI. But I think that we also need to think about, if we are going to have a lot of job opportunities, you know, how do we set up that foundation to make certain people are able to harness those opportunities? And I know it was alluded to, but I just kind of wonder, you know, what does that look like? And obviously, you know, we have to see, but there are going to be opportunities, but there's also going to be some, guess what, growing pains as well.
I definitely foresee that. Yeah, I definitely agree. And I think that's where this initial hesitation is coming from. It's an indicator that there will be growing pains as society kind of evolves with the technology. Anyone else, Carlos, Ali, any thoughts on this, or should we open it up for Q&A? Let's open it up for Q&A. All right, so if you have any questions for our awesome panel here, we have a lot of experience, a lot of brain power. Feel free to pop in your question or anything you'd like to discuss really in the chat. If you feel comfortable, you're welcome to come off of mute and also just join the call. So we'll open it up, and who's going to be the first here to get us a good question?
I can go first. Hi.
Hi.
Thank you so much for being a part of this. I'm curious from just like a perspective, because I know all of y'all work for private companies, how open should a company be about what kind of bias that they have? Part of the reason I ask is my partner, he does open source programming for machine learning. And so I see it more on that side where he's really open and he's like, hey, there's problems and I have to figure them out. And in the community, we all have to figure this out. But I don't see that very often. I think it was just so refreshing for me because I was like, oh, but I don't see it very happen too often in the private sector. So I'm just curious on y'all's perspective on that.
He sounds like a keeper from my side. I like the way this guy thinks, but let's open it up. Panel, what do y'all think on the question here?
I can talk a little bit about this one. There are definitely some things that we can share, but then there are other things that we can't. It's a terrible answer, I know, but it's one of those it depends ones. So like when it comes to like, let's say when I was at Adobe, because right now I'm at a startup, so it's not as like, anyway, so at Adobe, we would do a bunch of different compliance checks, audits, even in the testing space. You create test plans and you have test strategies and whatnot. You measure different quality attributes like reliability, uptime, that kind of stuff as well. There's a lot of things there that you can share because you share these SLAs and SLOs with your customers. It's part of the contract that you say, like, we're going to always be up this amount of time, for example. And so there's some data that you're able to share with that, some of the results of the testing and monitoring you're doing. But then there's things that like Adobe wouldn't want you to share. So it's an interesting topic because it's like in my current organization, like I would love to be able to make as much of it, as public as possible, to be able to say like, here is even like papers of like, here's what we've done so far. Here's the scores that we have. Here's the biases that we know exists. And here's some other questions or assumptions we have. And then everything else is unknown. That'd be interesting. It's something that I don't have a great answer for, but it'd be one that I would be very interested in doing and publicizing if I'm able to.
It's interesting to think in this space. It reminds me a tiny bit, I hope this isn't an awful comparison, but it reminds me of hiring and just diversity and inclusion in companies in the employee population. And so some of the things that I'm seeing on that side is we have companies that are publishing their stats of how their company is stacked up. Do you all ever see a future where we're doing the same for large data sets?
I think the biggest challenge is knowing that or learning about that bias in the first place. I think the gap, but like is to me there's a bigger unknown portion than known issues portion that the companies can publicize. Like, what I believe is like once you find issues as an engineer or the company or the product, you're actively trying to solve those, and hopefully like those issues won't stay there for a long time. But then the unknown part is always going to be bigger, which is your blind spot. I don't like it depends on what the knowns are, and if you know the issues in a way that you're going to be able to fix them in the near future, then I don't like see the value of being very vocal about those issues that you're going to resolve in a few months or weeks, for example.
Late at that point, yeah, I think you're right. Yeah, that makes sense. Lou?
Yeah, I just wanted to add, so from my standpoint, in terms of being a part of a company where they make tools, where people use the tools to help create AI systems, I can see from an industry perspective that there may be some organizations that start to share more of that type of information for transparency, and also can be part of their, let's say, technical specification. So I can see that happening in industries such as maybe the automotive industry or in some segments of the aerospace industry. In terms of others, for a variety of reasons, I don't see that happening, or at least not in the near future.
Yeah. I'm also curious about governance protocols being shared and things like that. Like, are there companies that will take stands and say, this is our bottom, this is the minimum that we will always do to ensure bias is mitigated? Because that would be really interesting for me personally. Melissa, hopefully does that answer your question?
I mean, to the best that you could do it, which I appreciate.
Awesome, great. And we do have some other questions coming through in the chat. So let me just pull one up here. How do we test for bias if you're missing the necessary information? E.g., race or ethnicity is missing from the data. Who would like to respond to that one?
And test with bias. So one of the things that we do in just software testing is we use funnels, we use personas, which essentially means like, for example, like if you go to Amazon.com, the way my mom would use Amazon.com is super different from how my dad would use Amazon.com. My mom would fill the shopping cart with just a bunch of things that she's like, oh, that's nice. Oh, that's nice. Oh, that's nice. My dad would be the person that just buys a single item and doesn't even look at anything. He's like, yep, I need that. And he would just buy it, right? But two completely different personas, two completely different experiences and ways that they approach your product. So if you are aware of these personas, if you're aware of these funnels, then you can test using the same stuff, right? So I could, using that CV resume thing again, if we didn't know, like in America, at least that I know of, we don't put our ethnicity and things inside of the resume, right? You don't put that. In some countries you do for sure, and it's required by them too. So let's say we were just focused here in Utah where it's not required to put in your ethnicity, you wouldn't have that data point to work with, you wouldn't have that feature. But that doesn't mean that when you test it, I could test with the resources that I have access to test for that bias if I believe that's going to be in there. So I could say, hey, everyone in Techqueria, whoever wants to help me test this thing, y'all are brown, y'all are my Latino friends, go in here and try this thing out and let's see how this thing works. And that would be just one way of testing it out. If I wanted to see if it was filtering people out that were under the age of 30, I could then have that be a completely different funnel and get people that are under 30 apply to it and see what that looks like as well. There's automated ways of testing for these things too. But you can test for these things but you have to be aware of the bias. You have to be aware of the hypothesis you have in mind and the experiments you want to target. And that's the difficult part because it's the humans that have to come up with these kinds of test sets or test inputs. And you still have to come up with an oracle yourself. In testing, we say oracles. It's essentially what you want the output to be based on the inputs you're giving it. And so you have to define what those things are too. So in a way, it's almost like when you're testing, you're also introducing some bias. But that makes software testing fun as well. And I won't talk about that. But yes, you definitely can. And using things like personas, funnels, categories, things like that, you can also test for these things too.
And I think in my personal opinion in the last few years is, to Carlos's point, because when you're testing, you will have your own bias. So I think recognizing the fact that you will have your own bias as a first step is very, very important, because then you need to invest in strategies and in pipelines and infrastructure to help you identify your own blind spots. You will never be able to get the model right in the first iteration. You will always have to go back and fix things. You'll always have to go back and more data. I think it's better to roll out the first version, be more open-minded, and have the infrastructure and checks in place to identify areas where you're missing, rather than over-optimizing at the front end and not taking care of or thinking about what happens after you've launched things. I have it. In general, it's very iterative, so you have to be that way.
Looks like Israel has some thoughts, and then we can go to Stephen.
I was just going to say that I have slightly different thoughts on this. First of all, we when we build AI models, we rely heavily on the experts, because the experts are the ones that understand how the problem is best solved, right? They understand what's important in terms of variables and input, and they also understand they're hopefully accountable for the outcome, right? So even though you build the AI model, you're still responsible for ensuring that model it's a fair representation of the society, if you will, and it's also giving you results that are meaningful. And so I would say, for example, in the case of hiring people, I would probably make sure that my slate of candidates is diverse before I actually make a decision. If there's not enough diversity in the slate of candidates, then I don't want to, I go back and say, hey, you know what, this is not good enough. We got to do it better. The other point that I would make is, like, I think to Carlos' point, you can always, these things learn, right? So if you don't have the right model from the get-go, the model can always be enhanced with more data as it becomes available. And the third thought that I would share is, in my world, at least, when we don't have data about you know, like if you think about machines, the things that are really, really catastrophic events don't happen very often, right? They'll happen once or twice in the lives of the machine. So sometimes what we have to do is that we need to create patterns, synthetic data that we call it, that essentially represents those kinds of events, right? So if we have only one pattern about a catastrophic failure, then I find ways to replicate that pattern with synthetic data so that I can create more and balance my data set. So there's all kinds of techniques to balance data sets, but I think you as a person that's consuming the outcome of that model or the insight have to be able to, you know, to be able to assess how good that might be, right? That's very important.
Yeah, I've never heard of synthetic data in this way. Very, very interesting. Lou, it sounds like you have some thoughts on it too.
Yes, but I know I saw one other person's hand.
I believe it was Stephen. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't want to jump in front of Stephen, so I can wait. Sorry.
I'll wait for the next question. I was going to ask a question. So if we're still on this question, let's finish up on this question. Totally cool.
Okay, thank you, Stephen. So I'll try to be brief. So in terms of kind of one last thought, I think one of the items that seems to be a reoccurring theme is, you know, the members of this panel, probably the larger audience, we are willing to be introspective to make certain we take a step back and reflect. I think one of the biggest questions that's coming up, and this happened to me a few days ago, I was modifying a neural network and the accuracy was questionable. And there was an individual who said, oh, you know what? Why do we need to go back and remodel? And yeah, I'm looking at Stephen's face. I agree. I had that same expression and it was scary. So the big theme I want to point out is, you know, we can't answer it here, but what about those individuals who have that behavior? What do you do with them?
Yeah, it's a great point, Lou. And I would also say business is pushing a lot of the times for speed and is pushing for progress and let's get it done and let's go. And now that AI has entered, you know, commoditized markets and different products to enhance them, there is that pressure sometimes. And so it can be difficult to manage.
Yeah, if everyone was perfect at it, my entire industry wouldn't exist. The entire software testing qualities, if everyone was perfect at it, yeah, we wouldn't even exist. So the fact that we are a very large industry is hopefully just proof that there's, you know, it's good to have multiple people collaborating with different specialties, you know, and yet generalized as well. So yeah, and then the very last thing, because we've been mentioning things like synthetic data for like automated types of things, that we mentioned some manual ways of doing it too, and creating your own or working with different groups of people for those types of personas and whatnot. In regular software, traditional programming, we use lots of operation things like a rings of deployment or canary deploys or blue-green or whatnot. That way you can test your software, in this case, your models, and say, I wonder how this group of people how it affects this, or even this one customer. So at Adobe, we would do this a lot. We would make a feature and we say, let's give it to Nike and Adidas and let's see if it works for them. If it's working for them, we're going to go to 5% of our customer base, keep monitoring, observing there, and then keep going up until finally you got up to 100%. And now it's a feature. So there's so many different strategies and techniques you can use to measure, observe, learn, iterate, tons and tons of them. So taking advantage of all of that and being aware of all those things will help you in all of this as well.
Awareness is key. I really also loved when Ali was saying, you know, just assume that you're going to have a bias. Have that awareness that you're going to have some kind of bias and that you will need to mitigate it. I really like that approach. Stephen, I'm so sorry for the delay. What's your question?
I was going to ask, you know, this is as an emerging field, we've seen like the roles start to get kind of condensed, right? You used to have like the statistical person, the data science person, the data engineer. And I'm curious, as experts and people who worked in this now, are we seeing more, as these three converge, one, is that a threat to diversity and kind of the stuff we were talking about, like algorithmic biases, more amateur folks kind of enter and deal with stuff? Or B, is it an opportunity because actually, to kind of Carlos's experience, right, more people can now self-teach and we can diversify the people who are doing the thinking. So I'm curious, is this gonna just like evolving and advancement of the ease with which you can access AI, is it going to fix things or is it going to make things worse?
a great question.
I'm happy to take it if no one else does, but I feel like I've been talking a lot.
Looks like you're on, Carlos.
All right. So I mean, coming from again, like the software testing space, like beforehand, we call traditional testing where you have a dedicated test team and all the features have to go through this test team. Nowadays, that's a terrible idea because the testing becomes a massive bottleneck. And I can't say that for every industry, but for mainly like, I guess, SaaS and web and whatever, that's the case. You don't want a dedicated test team. So instead you want to have these generalizing specialists, people that are good software engineers, but specialize in something. So you might have someone that is super good at front end. They know React and JavaScript like no one's business. Awesome. But they're a software engineering generalist where they can work in CI if they need to. They can change one of the models or schemas if they need to. They can do that as well. But they are super good and they really enjoy the front end work. Same thing with a software tester. You want them to be generalized software engineers, but they specialize in testing. And their goal is to make the rest of the team scale the testing and quality around all of them. Instead of just only the tester owns quality, you want the whole team to own quality. So if you take those same concepts and apply it to AI, I think you get the same thing. Right now at my current company, I do have a data engineer who's very good on the data engineering side of things, but their interest right now is blockchain. You know, that's what they want to get into. Where my data scientist, he's like, I'm actually more of a machine learning engineer. And he tells me this all the time. Every time I introduce him as a data scientist, he's like, I'm actually more of a machine learning engineer. And every data scientist I talk to, they have a completely different definition of what that means. And I think that's okay. That's just talking about the growing pains again, right? We're trying to figure out what this space looks like and what does a data scientist actually do? What are they over? And you have things like ML ops and machine learning engineers, and you have infrastructure. Well, my current data scientists that I have on my team, yeah, they're really good at building models and they're learning how to do stuff in CI and in the cloud. So that way they can do a lot on their own. They don't depend on a single cloud engineer to do all that for them. So they're learning and they're generalizing in that, and that's making them, I think, a better engineer overall. So I see it as a good thing. That's my opinion.
Any other opinions?
I don't know. I think I love the question, first of all.
Yeah.
I think the way that I think about it is more around, you know, the tools have advanced so much in the last 10 years. It's unreal what you are able to do today with things like data robots and data IQ. You know, in my days, you had to code everything from scratch, which wasn't fun. So I think that, you know, and if you talk to any data scientist, they will tell you 80% of the effort is in cleaning the data, making it ready, and then the other 20% is what we use for modeling. I think eventually what's going to happen is that the tools are going to become really robust, right? And so hopefully it's going to empower the actual experts to do their data science and their AI work. And the beauty of that would be that they know they can distinguish good from bad, right? So the data scientists, you know, they'll still be around and they'll still be doing a ton of very difficult work, but I think the tools will enable more of the experts to take on the building of data science. But that's my theory. I'm not sure if that's going to pan out or not.
I think I have a slightly different opinion. I think because we have more and more tools and we are enabling more and more people to do these things, but there's another part of this equation, which is data. I think a far fewer number of organizations and companies have far wider access and control over the data, which hurts this problem significantly. So even if we have more people who are capable of doing these things with the new advanced tools and technologies, they might not have enough power to make a change because they just don't have enough data that is required to make that power. So I think having more people will probably not be very helpful unless the data is more widely accessible to solve these problems.
Great. Well, we'll all obviously stay tuned to see how things continue to pan out as we move forward and AI continues to evolve. It's going to be really interesting to see how we grow and how we get governance and how we get more, equity across this space and eliminate the bias. So this has been a great discussion, a lot of really great points made. Want to thank the panelists and Techqueria for having us and for putting this together. And thanks to all the participants. Stephen, thank you for your question, all the others that had questions. It's a pleasure to be a part of this. Thank you all. And El Futuro Llegó, it's here. So thank you all for joining and having a great conversation with us. Bye.